Hey everybody, Argent here. I know I streamed earlier in the day and I know that my voice is still probably pretty scratchy, but I really felt like doing this and I had a block of time. And it's the evening, so it is what it is. So, one of the next lolcows I wanted to tackle on my list is MovieBob, aka Bob Chapman. So he's pretty high on the list. A lot of people have asked for him. I haven't done a ton of research into him yet. And what everybody's told me, though, excuse me, is that if you want to understand MovieBob, if you want to understand Bob Chapman, you need to look at his book. You need to look at his book that he wrote about Mario, which is kind of an autobiography disguised as a book about Mario. So, this is his book, Super Mario 3 Brick by Brick. And we're going to go through the whole book, and I'll do this for an hour. If people want me to keep going, I will. If this format's kind of fun, there's some other books we could suffer through together. What else do I have? My Twisted World by Elliot Rogers could be fun to go through. But I have a reading app set up, so I'm just going to run through the book, commenting over it, and I'm going to stop and we'll maybe have a discussion at certain points. But this book isn't, my understanding, terribly long. Just as a preview of the kind of quality content we have. The console wars drag. He refers to the console wars on as his personal Vietnam. Are you going to read the whole book? We'll see. I'll probably step ahead a bit, but let's just see how far we get. Because it sounds like every part of this book is just a fucking dumpster fire. So let's begin.
Mario Brothers 3. Then, oops. It's not exactly crying.
Let me see.
Dedication to Gale Miyamoto for saving my life, more times than he knows. Christopher and Catherine Chipman for always being there. Peter and Patricia Chipman for everything. And in loving memory of Evangeline Chipman for setting an example. Introduction: why write a book about Super Mario Brothers 3? I'm going to assume somebody is asking that question. I am, and I'm the one writing the damn thing. A book more generally about Mario. The character
Notice that he
would seem to make more sense.
Miyamoto above his parents,
the icon of the video game
whose basement he probably still lives in.
A character is entrenched in the minds of generations X and beyond as Mickey Mouse and Bugs Bunny. Video games were the rock and roll of my generation, an art form that came into being and grew in tandem with our own lives, embraced by us to the confusion and...
Okay, is this better or is this better?
Video games were the rock and roll of my generation, an art form that came into being and grew in tandem with our own lives.
Or we can have a female voice if people prefer that.
Video games were the rock and roll of my generation, an art form that came into being and grew in tandem with our own lives, embraced by us to the confusion and exasperation of our parents, and though...
First was better? Okay, we're gonna go with this. We're gonna go with VW Paul then.
Video games were the rock and roll of my generation, an art form that came into being and grew in tandem with our own lives, embraced by us to the confusion and exasperation of our parents. And though he wasn't the first icon of the form, Mario was figured at the forefront, our Elvis, or, if you prefer, our Beatles. Which probably makes Pac-Man Chuck Berry in this analogy.
Oh my
in any
god,
case,
this is so
if this were to be a
obtuse.
book of history or of pop iconography, surely it would be more comprehensive and sensible to cover the full breadth of Mario's career. At the time of this writing, Mario has appeared in
If anybody wants,
90 individual games
just a
covering
second.
almost...
If anybody wants a actual good book on this topic, let me just find it. I'll post a link in the chat. Super Mario, how Nintendo conquered America. Okay, I would actually really recommend this book. This book I actually read. if you want like a good book about video games, the history of Nintendo and kind of the development of Mario, I really recommend that. The audiobook was really good. So let's continue.
Every conceivable gaming genre, 2 feature films, 1 live action, 1 animated and released only in Japan, 4 animated series, multiple comic books, and in nearly every form of licensed merchandising imaginable. The story of the character's eminently humble beginnings, of his iconoclastic creator Shigeru Miyamoto, of his endurance through a changing video game landscape and sweeping cultural shifts. Would these not be more logical things to build a book around?
They would, but I
And
didn't
even
want to
if
do
one
it
did
that.
wish to focus on only the games, why limit the scope to only 1 out of the 190? Especially when there are other games.
I really doubt that there's 190 Mario games. No fucking way. Like, it depends what even one counts as a video game, I guess.
In the series of greater historical significance, SMB3 is Mario's first appearance. That would be Donkey Kong, or the game that made him a household name by reviving the previously dead home gaming industry. That's the original Super Mario Bros., or the birthplace of functional, open-world 3D platforming, Super Mario 64 inches, or any of the franchise's myriad other big impact moments. It's merely the 3rd game in the Nintendo Entertainment System era of the franchise. Where's the import? Where's the story? What's the big deal? Assuming I was able to gather myself after receiving that withering barrage of queries all at once, I might offer that this book isn't precisely a book of history, though it will certainly contain its fair share, but rather a book primarily of video game criticism, which of course only begs more questions. Why start with Super Mario Bros. 3?
Okay, I hate these fucking self-indulgent opening chapters. Why write a book about ancient Persia? What relevance does... Sorry, what's that about a cock on my video? I don't know, whatever. Like it's I just hate these fucking introductions that go on for okay, you're doing it because people find it interesting. Just get to the fucking point. Don't do this big, I'm gonna cover this in a way nobody else has ever done.
Then, it's not exactly crying out for attention. It's one of the best-selling games in the series, and of all time, already enshrined as an accepted, unassailable classic. Do you intend to challenge that status? Reveal the game as overrated, perhaps? No? Then, again, why? New Super Mario Bros. Wii is more recent. Super Mario Sunshine is the most intriguingly flawed of the series. Super Mario Bros. And Donkey Kong are more historically significant. Super Mario Bros. 2 inches has the more interesting backstory. What, if anything, are you looking to tell us here? Why should we be reading this when there are so many tomes of self-help, political fire-breathing, and 12-volume epics of glimmering vampire bow huntresses attending wizard school? Just a bookshelf, or a swipe across the touchpad, as it were, away. To be honest, even I didn't start out with...
In other words, why would anyone read this piece of crap? Well, I'm doing it to make fun of this guy.
The project took shape before the subject came into focus for me. You see, at least to my knowledge...
Okay, let's just look at this. To be honest, even I didn't start out with the intent to write a book about Super Mario Bros. 3. The format of this project took shape before the subject came into focus for me. What the fuck does that even mean? I don't... What? You see, at least to my knowledge at the time of this writing, there isn't another book exactly like this one. This guy writes like I do. He uses too many, someone who knows the parts of speech, he uses too many qualifiers. It's just, oh, get to the
time
fucking
of this
point.
writing, there isn't another book exactly like this one. Video game criticism has existed as long as the medium itself, said medium having come into being in the era of specialty publications, read, lifestyle magazines, and reached adolescence in the age of the internet. Times where it became the norm that everything was to be reviewed, critiqued, and consumer reported upon. but the form has always had an erratic evolution. The first game reviewers found themselves in the unique position of having to be both art critics. What feeling or sensation does this game elicit? And product testers, does this device work?
By the way, at the expense of self-promotion, my bout of strep throat means that I was able to do a lot of editing on my book, No Chance. So hopefully in the next couple months I'll have it ready to publish. How I'm actually going to publish it, I'm not sure. If I just want to spare the drama and publish it myself on Amazon, or if I want to try to go to Countercurrents or somebody else, but I am actually determined to try to get it done, hopefully sometime this year. It's going to be better than this, I promise you.
The rapidly expanding technology of the medium and scope of the consumer base created fissures and divisions as different groups of gamers demanded different approaches from critics. Aesthetic critique, technical details. Does it have a good story? Forget the story. How does it play? Give me detailed analysis. Give me a numbered score. The internet age turned game criticism into one of digital journalism's fastest growing fields, with even more diversity, detailed write-ups, and cultural commentary from websites like The Escapist, Polygon, Destructoid, etc. Video reviews, often, but not always, comedic in nature, became the rage with the dawn of high-speed streaming, making unlikely superstars of folks like Bitchute,
biggest douche ever, bigger
James
douche,
Wolfe, aka
cool guy.
the angry video game
The
nerd.
AVGN isn't a reviewer
James's
though, he's a
focus on older and
comedian.
more obscure titles was part of a growing interest in giving serious critical attention and hindsight to classic or retro games. Today, sites ranging from professional outlets to
Okay, I just like to make a statement. Ben Yahtzee is the biggest fucking douchebag I've ever seen in my life. The second I hated that fucker's voice, I wanted to punch him in the fucking mouth and, like, just take out all his teeth and I don't know, throw him into the Australian Ocean so he could be eaten by crocodiles. I fucking hate that piece of shit. He's just this cynical douchebag who thinks because he has a British accent and he sounds sophisticated that he's somehow, I just fucking hate Yahtzee. I don't know if you'll ever find anybody who hates Yahtzee more than me.
Free-for-alls like YouTube and Blip are packed to the gills with an ever-growing supply of not only game criticism but walkthroughs, strategies, and long-form chronicles called Let's Plays. Name any game that has ever existed, no matter how
long-form
obscure,
chronicles.
and chances are you can find multiple reviews, videos, and full-length playthroughs of it. And yet amid all that, I felt like there was something missing. An empty niche. Maybe not a large niche, but a niche all the same. In my primary career I'm a film critic, so I get to see how criticism differs in the two mediums. And while I won't let this turn into some missive about what game journalism can learn from film, I'm inclined to note that the one type of critical attention gaming appears to be most, though not wholly, deficient of is analysis. In particular,
Okay,
deep
let's
analysis.
just reread this paragraph. This is amazing. And yet, amid all that, I felt like there was something missing. An empty niche. An empty niche. Maybe not a large niche, but a niche all the same. In my primary career, I'm a film critic. So I get to see how criticism differs in the two mediums. And while I won't let this turn into some missive about what game journalism can learn from film, I'm inclined to note that the one type of critical attention gaming appears to be most, although not wholly deficient of, is analysis, in particular deep analysis. I feel like that whole thing is just really, maybe someone who knows more about grammar can like agree with me that is fucking horrible the way that's written.
Specifically, in film writing there is such a thing as the shot-by-shot analysis, which is exactly what it sounds like. A book, or, more often, academic paper or presentation that pores over a single film piece by piece, scene by scene, detail by detail, the lines, the compositions, the shots, the score, and the actors, directors, writers, and production history that informed it all. Not just an aesthetic criticism or a history or a production report, but a fusion of all three and more, the complete picture of a film. Why didn't this exist for video games? My first thought, upon not finding
Well,
books that
it
lined
did.
up with what I was now looking for, especially not available to consumers outside the industry or academia, was that it may have been tried and found impossible. But that didn't make any sense.
Okay, let me just explain that. You can't do the same thing because video games are different. Video games normally have an engine that generates aspects of it. Not necessarily every aspect of the game is directly planned. A lot of it is just, I guess you could say, pre-generated. Like a lot of the buildings in the game are just pre-generated from existing models. So it's not really fair to go to every like scene in the game and try and analyze it for hidden meaning, because it's not always there. Now, if you're going to make the argument that you can analyze specific cutscenes or specific themes in the game or mechanics or stuff like that, then yeah, that is true, but that's been done. Like, for example, in BioShock 1, as the game went on, what you were supposed to do was use your guns less and less and your plasmids more to indicate that you were turning it more and more into a monster and less than a man, and less of a man. And that is, I guess, kind of, you can analyze that over time. So there's other things you can do like that. So you can do that analysis. It's just going to be different because it's a different art form. It's like analyzing a book word by word. A book is a much longer art form. There's often less emphasis put on a specific scene than there is on a whole. It's not fair to take something that's 20 to 30 hours long, all of which isn't pre-programmed precisely like a movie is, and compare it to a movie. They're just different. Just, I don't know, maybe that makes sense to people.
Games are tangible things, at least as much as digitized information can be. Most of them have beginnings and endings, or at least a point where nothing else can be done within them. Whole books, called strategy guides, had been written with the purpose of guiding one through a game step by step. So why not go the extra mile and gives a reader the background or an aesthetic observation about whatever level or boss you're helping them to conquer? And, if I couldn't find such a book, why not write it myself? The idea began to take shape. Pick a game. Play through it from beginning to end. Catalog everything you did, even the places where you did something wrong or had to start over. Describe, in detail, not just the function but the form, the whys and hows and who's behind.
Those exist. They're called after-action reports. Go to a Paradox forum.
What was happening in the game. For good measure, include what was going on for you during the playing. Player input is key to the experience. After all, so it's only fair to analyze the background of the player along with the background of the product. Yes, that might work, but which game? It would have to be an older game, for one. Not so much out of nostalgia or sentiment, but because an older game would have its stature already secure. Preferably it should be a popular game, one that a lot of people would have played.
Okay,
or
I'm gonna
at least
try
know
putting
of.
up the
A work that
speed.
has
Let me know if
affected
you
the
can hear it
culture in a
okay.
big, visible way simply offers more to write about. It should have a certain degree of variety, if for no other reason than to keep me consistently engaged so that boredom doesn't inappropriately color the analysis, even though I wouldn't be...
Okay, I just want to say this. Movie Bob in this book is saying that it has to keep people engaged so that boredom doesn't color the analysis.
Primarily playing for fun, I'd have to endeavor to maintain the sense of enjoyment that regular gameplay is supposed to engender. Finally, I felt like it should be a game I was already intimately familiar with, a game I could not just approach, but return to in the writing. Aside from, likely, making the project that much less difficult, it would be appropriate to the intended tone. Not just some dry, academic deconstruction, but an involved, emotive journey. I should be a game I loved, and thus...
Wow, there's a spelling error. I should be a game I loved. It's kind of like when I grew up, I wanted to be a blitzball.
There could be no other choice. Part 1, a brief history of Mario. Press start. By now, the legend of Mario's creation is old hat to fans, but those who didn't grow up marinating in the game culture still would likely be surprised at the utilitarian simplicity of his origins. Today we are used to receiving our cultural icons only after a lengthy process.
Someone else was reviewing this book and they said he just has a thesaurus. and then he just inserts random words. Like here, a utilitarian simplicity of its origins. That doesn't really make sense. I don't understand what that means. Game culture stew. You don't marinate something in the game called in stew. I don't fucking know.
The focused grouping and demographic charting, particularly video game personalities, who must often bear the weight of cross-cultural expectations. Japanese games frequently see their androgynous heroes transformed into hyper-masculine forms to better appeal to Western taste, and navigate the minefields of socio-political symbology. Just what is the proper length of a skirt between sexually empowered and pandering male fantasy? Mario, on the other hand, came about the old-fashioned way. A character was needed, and one was made in the best form available from the tools available. And rather than a marketing team or a team of demographic analysts, Mario sprang from the mind of one man, Shigeru Miyamoto. Today, Miyamoto is a living legend, the starry-eyed iconoclast of the video game industry, spoken of by other designers less like a contemporary and more like a mysterious sorcerer who deigns to walk among mortals. But, once upon a time, he was just one among hundreds of men and women toiling in the nascent days of the game industry. Doubtlessly too hard at work to even consider that their every tiny success and failure might be laying the foundations of an entirely new medium, a new form of art. Miyamoto's backstory is a mix of iconic and humble, almost perfect enough to render him as a character in one of his games. A precocious child with a great love of art, music and wilderness exploration who dreamed of growing up to be a manga, Japanese comic book, artist. Instead, he found himself working for Nintendo, a toy and playing card company that had moved into the video game business with decidedly mixed results. So goes the story. Nintendo's most recent game, and Miyamoto's first role as part of a design team, Radar Scope, had failed to replicate its popularity in Japan when it was exported to US arcades. The head of the company's newly established American branch, the nephew of its CEO, was stuck with a surplus of unwanted machines, and the decision was made to rewrite the game's program into something new so that the unsold units could be reprogrammed and their cabinets repainted. The task of conversion fell to Miyamoto, an unconventional...
Okay, so... Didn't he just say this wasn't going to be about the history of Mario? Like, he said this isn't going to be the history of this. This is going to be taking the game apart brick by brick. But I guess it's not brick by brick? Who the fuck knows?
Decision, given that he was primarily an artist and designer with little experience as a programmer, but one that would prove faithful. He was given very little to go on, just the requirement that all of the programming be built from the existing parts of Radar Scope, and an early suggestion that Nintendo might be able to secure the license for Popeye the Sailor. When that fell through, he had to develop new characters in the scenario. In doing so, he was making history. For the first time, a video game's characters and story were being developed before the interface was. The early Popeye brainstorming had naturally called to mind the scenario of rescuing Olive.
If you're interested in this, read that book. It covers it way better.
The idea that players would be enticed to keep playing by the goal of having to rescue the hero's girlfriend rather than simply trying to rack up more points. Simple and arch though it may have been, this would be the first time that a game had tried to engage players.
Wait a minute. Simple and arch? Though it may have been. What does that mean? Simple and arch. Okay.
Through narrative and emotion rather than strictly through competition, Ludo was replaced by a gorilla, Donkey Kong, which in turn suggested the girl abducted by ape finale of King Kong, which in turn suggested the gameplay of scaling a building in pursuit of said ape. But the game still...
There is a really interesting story over all of this. Apparently, I think it was Universal Studios or someone sued Nintendo over Donkey Kong, which is copy fraud because Donkey Kong is obviously a parody of King Kong. I bought this book for $6. Okay, I did pay for this. Just for you guys, because I wanted to read this, and I couldn't find a free copy anywhere, so I bought this as a $6 PDF. Sorry, so, yeah, that's what wound up happening. There was a lawsuit, and it turned out Universal didn't actually own the rights for the game either. For the character.
The main character, an avatar for the player. It needed a hero. In keeping with his desire for the game to have characters as well defined as the hardware would allow, Miyamoto wanted his hero, whom he was still considering calling MR Video, to stand out within the game, to have recognizable human-like movements in the face. And while video game graphics of the day placed severe restrictions on such ambitions, a clever artist could find a way. And so, MR Video got a big Italian-style mustache to give his face and nose definition in profile, and would wear overalls so that his arms would be more visible against his body. They'd call him Jumpman at first, but he soon got a new nickname based on his apparent similarity to one Mario Segale, a colorful real estate mogul who was Nintendo of America's warehouse manager at the time. The finished game, Donkey Kong, was a smash hit and Mario was born. Miyamoto would revisit the character soon after in two Kong sequels and Mario Brothers, a two-player co-op game reminiscent of Joust that introduced Mario's brother Luigi and gave them a new backstory as New York City plumbers combating an infestation of crabs, bugs and turtles in a room full of pipes. Nintendo, fueled largely by the success of Miyamoto-developed games, branched out into the home video game market until it collapsed in the US but was thriving in Japan. And the ability of these Famicom games to be longer and more complex led Miyamoto to expand his newly iconic character in an unprecedented way. The Golden Age, the title told the tale. Super Mario Brothers was Mario
said he
Brothers
wasn't going to do this, but he's
proportions.
covering it.
Instead of a single screen,
Like the whole
hop and
history.
bop gameplay would now be spread across an entire world that scrolled from left to right in the inaugural example of a genre that would come to dominate the golden age of video games, the side-scrolling platform.
I know, a lot of the games
Mario
in the
and
golden
Luigi
age
wouldn't
were
simply
pretty
be crossing
shitty.
the screen. They'd be passing through a whole world, different skies, different terrains, underworlds, even swimming underwater. And this whole world would need still more characters and stories to populate it. Mario gained the ability to grow to giant, or supersize via magical mushrooms a la Alice in Wonderland, eventually leading the fairy tale-inspired kingdom of castles and magic beanstalks that was being devised. Precisely how the Mario Brothers got there from NYC is the subject of much debate, to be named the Mushroom Kingdom. The hostage rescue scenario from Donkey Kong was revived with a new damsel in distress, Princess Peach, whom Western audiences would know as Princess Toadstool for more than a decade, and the turtle enemies of Mario Brothers were expanded into an entire race of creatures called the Koopas, a reference to Kappas, mischievous turtle-like demons of Japanese mythology, ruled over by the wicked Bowser. Mario and Luigi would traverse 8 worlds split into 4 levels, each ending with the conquest of an occupied fortress and all but the last teasing the player with a rescued hostage who would inform you that the princess was in another castle. The success of Super Mario Bros. Was immediate and overwhelming. The kind of electrifying impact that only ever happens once or twice in the lifespan of a medium. In its native Japan, the game served as an eye-popping send-off for the original Famicom as Nintendo shifted focus to an upgraded disk system version of the device. But in the West, especially the US, the game was the trigger for something much bigger, a full-on resurrection. While home gaming on machines like the Famicom had been steadily popular in tech-loving Japan, game consoles had been dead in America since 1983 when quality control issues and a weary consumer base had caused the entire industry to collapse in on itself. The entire industry thought Nintendo was insane for trying to launch the Nintendo Entertainment System, a US version of the Famicom, there, but the naysayers were caught slack-jawed as the NES became an instant earth-shaking McGavin in 1985, and it was SMB. The game was sold packed in with early versions of the system that propelled much of that momentum as Nintendo went on to become synonymous with the medium they brought back from the dead through most of the 80s and 90s. In Japan,
We
Mario
know
Super
all
Mario
of
Bros. 2
this.
is essentially a more difficult, slightly tweaked remix of the first game, but it was judged both too difficult for neophyte American gamers and too visually outdated by the time it would be reaching US shores. It would ultimately be released there a decade later as The Lost Levels. Instead, the decision was made to convert.
Okay, I'm gonna try to go ahead. This is unbearable. Okay, so let's go ahead. Life in Wartime.
Life in Wartime in 1990, Mario once again led Nintendo into a new age as the ambitious Super Mario World, Super Mario Bros. 4 inches in Japan, became the flagship title of Nintendo's 16-bit Super NES. And while the game was a major success, now remembered as a classic of the genre, and for introducing Yoshi the Dinosaur, one of the series' most popular characters. This was the beginning of the end for Mr. Miyamoto's plucky plumber as the unquestioned king of all video game heroes. Though it wasn't fully apparent to all gamers, especially not in the US, where the NES ran the floor all but unchallenged for almost a decade, neither Nintendo nor Mario were ever the only game in town. They had major competition in gaming-saturated Japan, and game-friendly home computers like the Spectrum and Commodore 64 went toe-to-toe with the NES in Europe. And while the NES dominated North American sales and Mario lorded over gaming's cultural image, they had a persistent challenger in the form of rival console purveyor Sega, whose Master System had out a serviceable existence as the brand XNES and whose Genesis beat the SNES to the 16-bit punch.
Okay, I'm gonna scroll ahead a bit. This is really fucking boring. Like, this is just, like, because this book wasn't about the history of gaming.
All over America, young consumers chose up sides. In those days, it was unheard of for an average kid to own more than one console, turning friend against friend as both companies gleefully stoked the fires amid skyrocketing sales. The console wars had begun. When the smoke finally cleared over the great conflict between SNES and Genesis, Nintendo had more or less come out on top in terms of raw sales and corporate stability. Mario certainly had a spectacular 90s with Yoshi's Island, Mario Kart, Super Mario RPG, a litany of cameos and side projects, and the 2 Super Mario Land titles on Nintendo's portable Game Boy handheld, the latter of which would introduce the enigmatic evil doppelganger Wario to the series' mythos. But the war had taken its toll in the realm of public perception. Sega hadn't removed or supplanted their rival, but they'd successfully launched the image of Nintendo and Mario as the face of all things old-fashioned, unhip, and childish in the industry. Though Nintendo hadn't helped their case by maintaining a Puritan policy against extreme violent or sexual content in an era where more explicit titles like Mortal Kombat and Doom were the talk of the industry. Within the industry, Nintendo increasingly came to be viewed in much the same way the Walt Disney Company had been in the 1980s, a powerful but stodgy and unmoving relic standing in vain against the tides of history, and much of their corporate behavior as the 90s wore on only reinforced that notion. At the 1991 Consumer Electronics Show, they made an infamous public spectacle out of unexpectedly breaking a CD-ROM console-making partnership with Sony one day after Sony had debuted the proposed device at the same show. It was here that the bigger value of Mario as an icon was coming into focus. The only conceivable way any game company could afford to conduct itself in such a way was on the strength of its first-party software. And with Mario in particular, Nintendo was holding the ultimate trump card, but even he wasn't invincible.
Oh my god, this is so fucking boring. Okay, let's go ahead. Okay, let's scroll ahead. I don't want a history of Mario. I want to get to... Okay, here we go, Mario and me. Let's get to this fucking freak show. I'm sorry.
Incredible, considering how humbly I came to meet him. Part 2, Mario and ME. My life in the Mushroom Kingdom. The time before Mario and I were born the same year, 1981. I'm about 5½ months older, and as such I don't really remember a world without him. Looking back as best as I'm able, I know I must have been aware of his existence as long as I was aware of anything else, but I'll confess that I was not an immediate devotee. Arcade games, both in full...
Mario and I were born in the same year. I'm about 5½ months older. What the fuck?
Arcades and as individual machines at restaurants or convenience stores were fairly common then, so I'd certainly seen the Donkey Kong machine about. And I distinctly remember Mr. Rogers once demonstrating how arcade cabinets worked via that same machine. I remember seeing the DK cartoon show, featuring Mario, once or twice. Though it wasn't part of my regular TV viewing, He-Man was more my thing, at the time. In fact, apart from those aforementioned ventures to arcades, most often the one at good old Salem Willows Park, video games were just not much of a presence in my early life. Home gaming, a big fad in the late 70s and early 80s, was well into its famous crash when I was becoming conscious of the world around me. The only thing I really knew of it was that it was some kind of grown-up toy, since the only time I ever saw a console was when my uncle and aunt would come over to hang out, after I was supposed to be in bed, and he and my father would play through a game or two of baseball on Dad's Atari 2600, a machine that, with its black and wood panel design, looked like all the other grown-up toys. The stereo, the station wagon, that I wasn't supposed to play with. Even the marketing blitz that accompanied the launch of the Nintendo Entertainment System in 1985 didn't really intrigue me. Advertisers hadn't really figured out how to translate the fun of game playing through commercials yet, and early NES ads focused on the system's more explicitly toy-like features. ROB, a toy robot that ostensibly served as a second player in some games but in reality was Nintendo's bid to make toy stores feel more at ease stocking their product, and the Zapper-like gun. Well, I already had toy robots. Optimus Prime was much cooler than ROB, and I'd seen other toys purporting to interface with TVs that didn't look like that much fun to me.
This is so fucking awful. Oh my god. Like, what is the point of this? I don't get this. It's fucking weird. I don't know.
I was with my mother, paying a visit to the home of a new friend. We'd met in kindergarten, and my mother wanted to meet his before we arranged any play dates. I was the firstborn, so research like this went into pretty much every decision. While our mothers chatted, my friend had something he wanted to show me in the kitchen, his NES, currently sitting on the kitchen table hooked up to a small TV set, and there, on the screen, was Super Mario Bros. I was captivated immediately. I had never seen a video game, at home or otherwise, look like this, instead of the usual black background populated by conflicting neon shapes. Here was a bright blue sky with puffy white clouds over rich brown earth and green bushes. The creatures were identifiable, with eyes and feet and movement. The bricks looked like bricks. The castles looked like castles. And there was Mario, chubby, clad in unassuming overalls and his preposterous mustache, looking for all the world like no hero of anything else that I'd ever seen. I watched him play, gladly, for what seemed like forever. It was probably more like 20 minutes, before I was offered a turn myself. I was terrible at it, dying repeatedly, but I was also transfixed. This miraculous machine, to my eyes, projected a cartoon that you could control onto a TV, and there were more of them than this. Ones that looked, according to my friend, even cooler, with soldiers and bombs and cars and all manner of things, and maybe even more with this Mario person whose image now refused to leave my mind. I was mesmerized. I was hooked. I was sold. My parents, on the other hand, would take further convincing. My brother and I were not exactly hurting for playthings. A game console was quite an investment, and I can only assume they remembered that the last time a toy like this had become a big deal it hadn't lasted for very long. In addition, well, I was not the easiest child in the world to be raising at the time. I was bad at school. Mainly, I acted out in class, sassed my teachers, zoned out into daydreams, and turned in a lot of poor work.
And 30 years later, nothing has changed. So, MovieBob's talking about how he sucked at school, and being the genius that he is, this is why we should take him seriously. Cool.
So it wasn't as though I was in for some kind of attaboy reward that an NES would fill. Instead, they broke out the old Atari 2600 and said it could be mine now, thanks to the NES. The market had come back to life and they were making games for the system again. It was no substitute for an NES, and especially not for Mario. But it was something, and looking back, starting with such an earlier form of gaming helped refine my skills and probably gave me a lot more respect for the evolution of the medium overall.
Skills.
Meanwhile, I was filling page after page and drawing paper with painstaking recreations of the vivid images I'd seen on my friend's kitchen TV, that wide open world, those fearsome enemies, that iconic hero. And this is supposed to be the part where I tell you how I got my NES, the circumstances, the reasons, how I felt, except I don't remember. That sounds ridiculous, even to me, given the subject of this book and the detail with which I recall everything else. Granted, I was 5, but still nobody is more surprised that I don't remember exactly when I got it. Christmas? Birthday? Good report card? Unlikely. Even my family didn't recall the exact details. One day I didn't have one, the next day I did. I feel strangely bad that I don't remember this. It makes me feel ungrateful, like something this important should have stuck in my head, permanently, by sheer force of gratitude. But maybe that's the point. Maybe the act of finally procuring my own direct access to Super Mario Bros. Was so monumental to my young mind it rendered everything else occurring immediately around it non-existent in my mind. What I do remember is that my young life now had a clear dividing line, pre and post NES. The new world in any case.
What a fucking autistic faggot. What a fucking autistic faggot. Fuck this guy.
At last, I had it. My very own Nintendo and my very own copy of Super Mario Bros., both of which I could play whenever I wanted for however long I wanted, providing I kept my grades up, kept my behavior decent, and promised to share with my brother, of course. Soon enough there were games other than Mario, Duck Hunt, Balloon Fight, Ice Climber, The Legend of Zelda, Contra, the same sampler of classics a lot of Generation NES remembers. But SMB was the one I kept coming back to. Helpfully, the game was actually extremely hard to complete. I never actually beat Bowser on my own without help until years later, to be honest. My brother and I would take turns playing through, trying to get just a little bit further. Sometimes Dad would help out. For the longest time, he was the only one in the family who could do the famous one-up trick on level 3-1. The NES and Mario were the first toy that I ever loved enough to invest into the broader culture around it. I played the game constantly, but I also devoured any shred of information about games that I could get my hands on. I tear through books and magazines about games when I found them at the store. I'd pump my NES-owning friends on what was new and awesome. I read every scrap of info about Mario I could find, especially. It was during this research that I came to know that Mario was a plumber, for example, which made my connection to him that much stronger since that was also the profession of my grandfather, whom I adored. On the schoolyard, I learned from friends of a magazine Nintendo Power devoted only to NES games. That in and of itself was enough to interest me, but the game being advertised on the cover of its 1988 inaugural issue was a dream come to life. Super Mario 2? I just had to get a subscription. I did, as a Christmas gift. The first issue now hangs in a frame on my wall, and I definitely had to have that game. Like most people, I didn't find out until I was older that what Western gamers got an SMB2 was actually Doki Doki Panic, a different Japanese game from Mario's creator that had been reprogrammed to feature Mario and his friends as the playable characters. But the fact that Mario's second game was so remarkably different from the first, a whole new playstyle, new enemies, a new main bad guy named Ward, actually made me even more invested in the character and his world, now worlds, by virtue of how big it suddenly seemed. Video game sequels, at the time, were typically expansions or refinements of their predecessor. This had, of course, been the case with the real SMB2 in Japan, but here was a part 2 inches that suggested, simply by existing, that Mario was more than just the graphics and gameplay that had come first. He may not have been an especially well-developed character in the games themselves, but in my mind he was bigger and more richly drawn than any other hero in games by virtue of this newly revealed malleability.
This book isn't, like, even long. This book isn't long at all. And yet, this whole thing is just him rambling.
If Mario could fight evil in the Mushroom Kingdom and Sukken, SMB2 is said to take place in a world of dreams, there was no limit to what he could do. In between,
the world
and
of
sometimes
dreams?
during
What the
sessions
fuck?
of gaming, my imagination would be alive with what Mario and company might be saying or doing beyond the borders of the story I was playing through. Soon enough, I wouldn't have to wonder. Beyond borders, looking back at it objectively, the Super Mario Bros. Super Show was one of the most ridiculous things I ever devoted time to watching as a kid. An hour-long eyesore of self-conscious kids separated from earlier, equally baroque kiddie programming, only in that its pool of visual references were culled from Nintendo ephemera instead of circus clowns or animal puppets. One half of the thing was a blatant lift of Pee-wee's Playhouse, with pro wrestler Captain Lou Albano and character actor Danny Wells as a live-action Mario and Luigi having slapstick adventures in a basement plumbing office, also populated by wacky props and creatures where every frantic physical comedy gag was punctuated by a video game sound effect rather than the traditional boing. These scenes framed the show's main event, episodic animated adventures of Mario and company as they battled King Koopa, a fusion of Bowser and SMB2's Ward, as Nintendo hadn't informed the animators which villain would be the ongoing baddie in the games, through comic adventures and the occasional broad movie parody. Except on Fridays, where the cartoon segments switched over to a Moonlighting-esque adaptation of The Legend of Zelda. Of course, I loved every minute of it. However ubiquitous Mario and games in general were to my generation were children, and children don't run the culture. So when some sliver of the culture featured one of your game heroes as a show, movie, comic, etc., you almost had to snap it up, not knowing where the next fix was going to come from. Neither the Super Show nor the various comics and books pushed out as tie-ins were high art, but it was what we had, and they helped further solidify the idea of Mario as a character with life beyond the games. This was also the first point where you started to see video games stretch beyond their separate sections at toy stores and elsewhere. There wasn't the deluge of Mario merchandise there is today, but you started to see them around, especially at smaller shops that imported bulk sundries from Japan where these things were more heavily merchandised. I found a small, sturdy figurine of Mario holding up one of the vegetables from SMB2 in a tiny outlet while vacationing in New Hampshire, and wound up carrying him in my pocket the rest of the way through grade school as a good luck totem, which I very much needed.
What the fuck was that? What the fuck was that? It's okay, so this dude somehow got a figurine of Mario holding up a vegetable, and he carried it with him for the next multiple years in his pocket as a good luck charm? What the fuck? I don't know. Sorry, just people in the chat are asking me about the latest DSP stuff. Yeah, I'm following it. I just don't like to do a DSP video more than once a month. Argent, should you ever review MGS series or have some sort of analysis just like Game of Thrones? Yeah, I have a lot of backlog. Have you ever noticed why I have so many videos? It's because I have so many things to talk about. I do want to do something on Steak Eater. Just Kojima's fucking insane, so it's hard to really come up with something to say in particular. But this asshole carried around a Super Mario luck charm for a really... I don't fucking know. Let's just continue.
I found a small, sturdy figurine of Mario holding up one of the vegetables from SMB2 in a tiny outlet while vacationing in New Hampshire, and wound up carrying him in my pocket the rest of the way through grade school as a good luck totem, which I very much needed. I should stress, lest I come off as even more obsessive about these things than I actually am, that I did have other interests. I'd become a voracious reader, thanks in no small part to my Nintendo Power subscription, and a lover of science and technology, which in turn had led me to an interest in special effects, which in turn led me to a greater fascination with films and filmmaking. And I certainly had other venues of entertainment. Like many others our age, my brother and I were consumed by the world of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles for much of the late 1980s. What Nintendo and Mario were was my happy place, my constant. While I won't claim that I had anything close to an unhappy childhood, particularly compared to many of my friends, I wasn't having an easy time of pre-adolescence. I was, quite emphatically, a nerd in every sense of the word, save for academic excellence. I had too much.
Okay, that's amazing. He's a nerd who sucked at schoolwork. In other words, he sucked at everything. He bought into a subculture that was about intellectual achievement, and he was just shit at that, too.
Of a problem with authority to be any good at schoolwork, but was still too weird and bookish to be accepted by most of my peers. Instead of dealing with this in some kind of mature fashion, I made one bad decision after another, including the classic asshole move of trying to endear myself to the cool kids by trying to join the name-calling and belittling of the other uncool kids. A part of me will probably hate myself for that until my dying day. I should probably add that I was attending a Catholic school at the time, so all my issues came packaged alongside an inseparable religious guilt to boot, and the teachers, free from the rigors of dealing with kids with serious problems like their public school counterparts, had plenty of time to devote to fixing me. I was in the principal's office a lot, and so were my parents. They tried therapy, but I developed an unhelpful hobby of reading about child psychiatry techniques and then either purposefully subverting them or smugly informing the therapist that I knew why he was doing what he was doing. I even had an...
So he was some kind of like sociopathic douchebag who was universally despised by everybody around him. Okay.
EKG, which at least required me to stay up all night beforehand watching Nick at Night and playing Nintendo, so there was that. They recommended Ritalin and other mind-altering drugs, but my parents said no. I thank them at least once a month for that, sometimes more.
That's the most fucking random, weird way to say it. I miss them. I thank them at least a month for that, sometimes more. What the hell is that?
The most reliable escape I had was almost always Mario. While I could get bored with even my favorite movies or books after a while, the games were always a little bit different every time I played. So I played them, and watched the cartoons, and read the comics and the magazines, and filled my notebooks and sketch pads in the margins of my textbooks with Mario drawings, and felt my ears perk up when rumors began to swirl of Super Mario Bros. 3 inches when it came to Mario. The rest of the world was about to catch up to me. The third AGE, the lead up to the release of SMB3, was unprecedented in video.
The third age was this fucking Lord of the Rings
game launches, and definitely exceeded the pageantry surrounding the release of anything I was ever intensely interested in. Sporting events, holidays, and certain movies got big, overblown coverage. Not video games, not until now, but I never heard anything real about the making of one outside of my own fever, Nintendo-saturated imagination. The news came from encountering a fellow gamer at the campground at our fourth yearly family trip to New Hampshire. He said he'd seen a Japanese magazine showing Mario 3. He said Mario turned into a raccoon, or something. What? My first look at it came from, where else? Nintendo Power, a short puff piece that was, in my mind, akin to a vision from God. Mario had a raccoon tail, it made him fly, he would dress like a frog. Bowser was...
See, my parents made the smart decision when I was that age, and they put me into therapy and they put me on medication. And that's why I'm, like, functional today and I'm not dead from having committed suicide. So, I don't know, if Bob's parents had have forced him to go through therapy, he probably would be more functional. But whatever.
Back and had children. This was also the first time I ever saw behind-the-scenes game development images. It may even have been the first time that I was conscious of Shigeru Miyamoto's existence as Mario's creator. And I recall buying a bunch of graph paper when I saw that was how the designers...
Okay, I don't get how this dude works. So... I don't understand how this dude works. So he spent all his time looking up stuff about Mario, but he didn't know who Shigeru Miyamoto was, or anything about Miyamoto.
We're plotting out sprite art. Actual news about the game came out in an agonizing trickle, but it didn't stop the hype from continuing to build. Local news shows ran interviews with excited store owners. Magazines that weren't about games reported on it. Every kid I knew was excited about it. And then there was a movie. Man Behind the Curtain, The Wizard is a fairly terrible movie, and also one of the most bizarre examples of a children's film ever produced. The plot is a shameless, beat-for-beat rip-off of Rain Man, recast with preteens. A kid, Fred Savage, breaks his younger brother out of an institution. He's suffering from a vaguely defined traumatic disorder, and, after discovering that said brother has an almost superhuman aptitude for video game playing, he's the wizard of the title, schemes to hustle.
I remember one time back in, what was it called again? High school, I was invited by some guys on the Something Awful forums to Shitty Movie Night, and or maybe it was Destructoid. It was one of the two, but we were watching The Wizard, and The Wizard. I actually just left because I didn't realize it was The Wizard. I thought The Wizard was going to be about video games, but it wasn't.
Their way to Las Vegas so the kid can prove his sanity by competing in a gigantic gaming competition. Like other hobby movies of the 80s, Rad for BMX bikers, Gleaming the Cube for skateboarders, it was prefixed on wish fulfillment and pandering lionization, presenting the world as young gamers wished it could be. Games were everywhere, a big enough part of the world that massive crowds would assemble for a competition, but also still large enough that gaming skills could help you thwart the will of clueless adults. For the most part, however, it's kind of a dark downer of a movie. Sad kids, angry parents, bleak backstories in the end of the 80s on Wii. Oh, and it's a Nintendo commercial too. Most movies about video games just made up their own rather than pay licensing fees. But Nintendo was behind
this
one,
is
so their products and
unwatchable.
services were everywhere. Not only were the kids and adults always finding an excuse to play Nintendo games, but a nasty bad kid antagonist wields the notoriously clunky Power Glove controller like a Bond nemesis is showing off his doomsday weapon, and the Nintendo Power Game Counselors, a tip line you could call for help with any game. Gotta shout out.
Okay, I have a confession. I actually liked the Super Mario Brothers movie, and I got it out of the store multiple times as a kid. It was just so crazy, so bizarre, and just, it was like David Lynch. It was like a David Lynch Mario movie. I fucking loved that shit.
Well, but the real star attraction, Super Mario Bros. 3. Even with a Nintendo connection, the Wizard probably would have passed without much notice. But Nintendo and the producers had a secret weapon. The first gameplay footage of SMB3 would be revealed to Western audiences through this movie. And they made sure everyone knew about it. So, on December 15th, 1989, me and hundreds of thousands of other kids across America lined up for The Wizard. I'll admit that I was among those who fooled themselves into thinking it was a great movie for years afterwards. But on that day, all we really wanted was to get SMB3 in front of our eyeballs. Just let us see it. Please, just let us see it. Now, having watched the film much more often than it deserves since then, I can likely quote about 80% of it chapter and verse. You got 50,000 points in Double Dragon. I love the Power Glove. It's so bad. Video. ARRR Majadoon. He touched my breasts. California. But the climactic reveal of SMB3 is burned, no, seared, into my memory the way JFK's assassination was for my parents' generation. Or the way 9/11 would be for mine a scant 12 years from then, my God. Was it really only 12 years? In any case, the climactic reveal of SMB3 and the Wizard is an all-time marvel.
Okay, so he's comparing the reveal of Super Mario Brothers 3 to JFK assassination at 9/11. He's saying it was like as traumatic for him as 9/11 and JFK.
In the theater of the absurd, the Wizard stands stone-faced and emotionless on a preposterously over-designed stage. All smoke, lasers, and futuristic set dressing. Alongside his rivals, the Power Glove guy and the young woman. Behind them, a huge stadium crowd cheering. In front of them, towering screens displaying their individual game progress. The unctuous MC calls for quiet as he announces that the final, deciding match will test the competitors against a game that they have never, ever played before. In the crowd, the Wizard's family and road trip allies are struck with fear, believing his special gift contingent on his familiarity with the games he plays to the exclusion of all other extrovert engagement. Back up on the stage, the MC's guttural bellow proclaims the words, Super Mario Bros. 3. And there it is, the title screen, the flashing yellow 3. A map screen in a Mario game, the Troopas are back, the Goombas too, and question blocks. Yes. The raccoon tail, we didn't know to call it a tanuki yet, exists and it does make you fly. Was that a giant Goomba? In the film, the Rocky-esque suspenseful score drowns out the game's sounds, but in the theater the audience drowns out the film's very tone. This is meant to be a tense, will he or won't he contest to earn the happy ending, but we couldn't care less. This is what we came for. It's arrived. our victory is achieved. Across the country we sat there, jaws agape and hearts racing, as the most important thing that had ever happened blazed across the screen and before our eyes months before any of us would be playing it. Oh, the wizard wins, by the way, proving his mettle and reuniting his broken family. Not that anyone really cared. Super Mario Bros. 3 was real. We'd seen it. Now we just had to keep waiting to play it. The Mountaintop SMB3 came out on February 12, 1990, and, thanks to my sainted mother, within a few days I had a copy of my very own to play. For once I was the actual first on my block, and within my own circle of friends, to have it. Since the
reason that MovieBob turned out differently than DSP is his mother bought him the Wolverine toy, whereas DSP's mother didn't.
The bulk of this book is dedicated in part to my memories of playing through the game. I'll avoid preemptively repeating myself here. Instead, I'll try to convey as best I'm able what every other part of my world, gaming and otherwise, was like outside the game. What sticks out, what I remember most of all, was that this was the first time Mario peaked in the popular culture. The absolute height of his fame and renown during the period when he was the unquestioned king of video game heroes. As such, it was the first, and, for a long period, last, time that the rest of the world and I were almost in sync. SMB3 was the children's media story of the moment. The first opinion polls showing that kids worldwide recognized Mario equally or more so than Mickey Mouse were being breathlessly touted as "Hey boomers, you got OLD." Newswire puff pieces, and the rest of the world was finally waking up to what my generation of youngsters, and none more so than me, had known for years. The little fat guy with the mustache and the overalls was the coolest thing on the planet. The Super Show had long since slipped from first-run airwaves, but a new series based exclusively on SMB3 had taken its place, not in syndication, but in a Prime Network Saturday morning spot. There were Mario t-shirts, toys, and knickknacks in real stores, not just game-centric outlets or gray market import shops. Morning news shows covered the phenomena. There was even an SMB3 Happy Meal at McDonald's, the ultimate symbol of something having made it to an 8-year-old, at least. All in all, it felt a little bit like at least some of the differences between me and the rest of the world might have just been a matter of me being ahead of the curve, and now everything else was catching up.
Yep, MovieBob was so cool, he was ahead of the curve.
This, I thought, was the beginning of a new and better world. It was actually the beginning of the end. A boy goes to WAR marketing, especially youth marketing, in the 90s was all about dividing and conquering, establishing an identity for your product, encouraging a less attractive identity for a rival product, and getting consumers to flock to you to claim that good identity for themselves. We got a taste of this in the 80s with the Cola Wars, and Nike essentially started a race war among my sports fan friends by selling the Magic Shoe, and the Bird Shoe concurrently at the height of the Celtics-Lakers rivalry.
What the fuck? Nike started a race war among my sports friends by selling shoes? What the fuck?
But it was the great console war of the 90s that first drew me into that kind of corporate manipulated madness. As the new decade dawned, Nintendo had released the Super Nintendo Entertainment System. I got mine for making it out of the 5th grade without a single grade below a CR. The triumph of lowered expectations. And with its Super Mario World, I still insisted on calling it Super Mario Bros. 4.
So his parents gave him more video games because he didn't get any grades below C in the 5th grade? Is it even possible to get grades below C in the 5th grade? In Canada, I don't think you even can. I think you have to literally just not go to class get C grades that low. I don't really know. It doesn't make any sense. Bottom line, MovieBob was retarded.
Mario World until Super Mario World 2. Yoshi's Island ended my hopes of seeing the series numbers climb into the double digits. I played the hell out of SMW, obviously, and while I love those gorgeous 16-bit graphics, the expanded number of buttons, and Yoshi the dinosaur, most of all I knew almost immediately that SMB3's By the Ironclad stature as my favorite game of all time was in no danger of being challenged. The cape wasn't as cool as the tail, and I missed all the fun power-up suits. But whatever, it was the 90s. Video games had arrived as the coolest ticket in popular culture. The arcades were in the midst of a brand new boom, driven largely by a new generation of more violent games aimed at teenagers. Mario and Nintendo were the acknowledged kings of video games, and Bob Chipman, formerly Bob the Dork who's way too into his dorky video games, was now Bob the guy who knows everything about the world's hottest new pastime. Why, yes ma'am, I can tell you the best place to build up your EXP in Final Fantasy. What's that, sir? You can't quite make it through TMNT 2? Let me show you a code that might help. Pathetic fantasies, even for a 10-year-old, but that's really how I figured things were going. Hell, maybe that's how they were for just a moment. But that moment...
Oh my god, he's talking like, oh, okay, so this movie came out. I was kind of like, people were semi-interested in me, and then they realized how repulsive I was. They realized I didn't bathe properly, I couldn't interact with other people, and I was completely unable to be liked by anyone. So, yeah.
My moment didn't last. The Sega Corporation had always existed as Nintendo's principal U.S. rival. Others had come and gone. For a minute there we were all excited about the TurboGrafx 16. Ask your parents how that worked out, but they were the constant. Not so much a Pepsi as a brand X with a small but loyal following. Their Genesis console had been out for a few years already, touting its 16-bit graphics versus the NES and dipping a toe into the waters of combative marketing with the Genesis Does What Nintendo campaign. But they never had a Mario, with apologies to Alex Kidd fans, no, just no, and they never had any momentum beyond that of the loyal opposition. But when the SNES hit, removing the one advantage the Genesis had, Sega decided to go big or go home. Sega declared war. With the instantly popular Sonic the Hedgehog as their new mascot, Sega marketing switched gears from passively lauding what their products offered to aggressively attacking what Nintendo's didn't. It was, I realize now, a brilliant strategy. While games have never been bigger, the generation of kids who made them big, my generation, were aging into double digits and soon their teens, where the pressure to cast aside childish things could have spelled doom the medium, even though they were still mostly pumping out the same
This is how depressing his childhood was. His like his whole childhood, he talks about it being like super depressing because there was like this war between the different consoles, and this was like this was how bad his childhood was. I wish this was the biggest issue I had to worry about during my childhood.
Their longtime fans' devotion to carry them. This would become their definitive corporate behavior for years to come. Sega's campaign, on the other hand, was relentless and blunt in the way that only 1990s salesmanship could be. In Genesis commercials, sleazy store owners tried to steer customers away from the sleek, sexy Genesis toward the disinteresting SNES. While a stodgy old maid censor mock blast of Sonic while wondering, why can't he be more like the nice boy, Mario? In playgrounds and schoolyards across the country, young gamers chose sides and memorized their talking points for a while there. I was able to rattle off the exact numerical superiority of the SNES's on-screen color palette and the advantages of Mode 7 scaling and rotation capabilities. But it didn't matter. Sega wasn't selling games, they were selling a label, a shoebox-sized hunk of plastic and microchips that said you were on the cool team. Nintendo, playing the long odds, did themselves no short-term favors by maintaining a strict family-friendly image just as violent games were becoming the rage in arcades. When it came time to port Mortal Kombat to home consoles, they handed Sega the mother of all PR victories when Nintendo opted for a bloodless, censored version while Genesis offered an authentic translation. Just like that, my life was the ending of a downer Twilight Zone episode. Video games were in and I was still out for a brand new
but where is Sega now? And where's Nintendo now?
Mom and Dad for a Genesis, since they'd never go for it. In those days, having two game consoles was seen as an almost profane extravagance for a child, like having a weekend.
I also have a Sylveon plushie. We've been over this.
Both, and it was because his parents were divorced and his SNES lived at his father's house. Besides, I was Team Mario. Sega wasn't just his enemy, it was mine too. To a 12-year-old, that made sense. Hitting the wall outside the gaming world itself, the cultural import of Mario and friends seemed to be waning. In 1991, a new cartoon based on Super Mario World came and went, and even my overly forgiving eyes knew it was awful. Sonic had two series at the same time, both popular, and one, running on Saturday mornings, that's still remembered as one of the better cartoons of the 90s. Meanwhile, consoles were no longer exclusively driving the penetration of gaming franchises into the popular culture. Arcades were in the beginning of what would be their last big hurrah, and mega-popular series like the aforementioned Mortal Kombat and Street Fighter II were enthralling the popular imagination. Video games had never been more visible outside of their original niche, but it was looking as though Mario might be slipping into the background, a bygone hero from a bygone age. Unless, of course, he could be the one who conquered the one height of mainstream success that no other game hero had successfully surmounted, Hollywood. In 1993 there was Super Mario Bros., the movie, a live-action mess that barely resembled the games and that I prepared for with a zeal matching that for the Wizard. It was terrible, a generic 90s junkyard sci-fi dud in the mold of John
Fuck you, that movie was awesome.
At the box office and so profoundly horrified Nintendo and Miyamoto that they are reputed to have turned down every American movie and TV offer since. These are things I know now, of course. When I first read an official confirmation of an honest-to-goodness Mario movie in the pages of Mario Mania, an SMW strategy guide from Nintendo Power that included a 32-page character retrospective which I reread often enough to qualify it as an unofficial precursor to this book, all I could feel was excitement. Finally, That there would one day be a live-action Mario movie had been a dream and an inevitability as long as I could remember. He-Man had a movie. Superman and Batman both had movies.
Yeah, but
hell, Teddy Ruxpin
but
had a
He-Man's
live-action
movie was shit.
Great things got movies.
So was
Mario
Teddy
was the greatest
Ruxpin's.
thing. So Mario would get a movie, and I'd get to see the Mushroom Kingdom looking as grand and astonishing as I'd always imagined it. So when I read this official announcement from Nintendo Power, surely the only trustworthy source on such matters, I was elated not so much by discovery as by nearness. I was already waiting, and now
Okay,
my
fuck
wait
it,
was
I'm gonna
full.
have to skip ahead. This is unbearable. Oh my god. Okay, here we go. Let's go up a bit.
Things fall apart. High school and junior high before it was not quite the party that saved by
Wasn't
the bell,
this whole
and
thing
John Hughes
supposed
had
to be an
promised my
analysis
generation,
of
to say
Super
the
Mario
least. I
Brothers
was still
3,
locked into the Catholic
brick
school
by
track.
brick?
My brother would be in junior high before our parents figured out it just wasn't worth it. But whereas my primary school had been an uneventful little place, my high school was another story. Private and Catholic, but still very much downtown, mostly populated by Italian, Irish and Greek hoodlums whose families mainly paid tuition to keep them from having to go to the same schools as the somehow worse Black and Latino hoodlums. In my memories, the great console wars dragged on like my own private Vietnam, and it didn't help that I was still constantly in trouble.
Yes, I have to copy and paste that. That is the greatest quote of all time. The console wars. My own personal Vietnam. What
At school and in and out of therapy at the time for anger, attention and authority issues. However, it really only lasted a couple of years. In 1994, the Sony PlayStation came out. Unlike countless third challenger consoles before, it stuck around. The war was now more of a scattershot fracas, and since this was the booming Clinton economy, it was less unusual
Scattershot fracas? What the fuck is a scattershot fracas?
to see more than one brand of console to a household, particularly since Generation NES was speeding toward young adulthood with pockets full of their
Who the fuck says Generation NES? What the fuck does that mean?
own disposable income. The identity conflict of the Mario vs. Sonic days gave way to a maturity conflict. Sony, the first successful
Oh my god, he's talking about identitarianism with regards to the video game consoles people buy? What the fuck?
challenger from outside the gaming-only business built the PlayStation, which, for reasons I forget, we felt obligated to shorten it as PSX at the time, to look more like a VCR or stereo from a distance and utilize CDs instead of cartridges. That plus marketing campaigns emphasizing sports sims and other games targeted at older teens and college students drew a stark contrast between the machine and those from Nintendo or Sega with their candy-colored exteriors, toy guns and inescapable legacy as having originated as childhood playthings. The symbolism was unavoidable. PlayStation Gaming said I'm a gamer, but I've grown up. Still having your SNES plugged in? You might as well still be sleeping with a teddy bear. What made it especially rough, not as rough, I stress, as the more universal miseries of junior high and high school life, for me was how true that symbolism actually was. To be a geek about anything usually requires a level of investment that originates most often in childhood, meaning that geek culture is largely a culture of people holding on to vestigial pieces of their own childhoods. I still play
Okay,
video
I'm gonna skip ahead a bit. This is the worst. Oh my god. Let's see here. Let's see what this is.
Like SMRPG, Yoshi's Island offered the tantalizing prospect of a more narrative-oriented Mario adventure and the irresistible idea of finally setting up a Super Mario Bros. Continuity. The game was a prequel, set long before the events of even Donkey Kong, presumably, wherein the wizard caretaker of a still infant baby Bowser foresees the coming of the Mario Brothers and schemes
This
to kidnap them
dude
as babies from the storm.
somehow
Since this is a Mario
managed
game
to
change history. Things go wrong, and baby Mario winds
make
up
a
in the can of Yoshi
timeline
World,
for the
they
Mario
actually met before.
series.
On a quest to rescue his brother, the idea of seeing Mario's origin story had me playing through this game like a man possessed, even though by that point a teenage social life was leaving less and less time for gaming. I knew
You
the
didn't
end.
have a
I figured
social life,
Mario
that's a
and
lie.
Luigi would find their way back to Brooklyn, along with seeing their Earthrealm digs visualized for the first time in a game. I was intrigued to see if any indications would be made about how and why they found their way back to Mushroom Kingdom years later. The possibilities. And so, after a climactic battle against a towering, Godzilla-sized Bowser, another image I'd always wanted to see, I settled in to watch as the game's ending credits played out over an animation of the stork-flying baby Mario and Luigi back home. Any moment now, I just knew I'd see a 16-bit New York skyline come into view. But, instead, the closing text and final image tell a different story, as the brothers are delivered to. Where Mom and Dad live. The Mushroom Kingdom. What? Mario and Luigi were born in the Mushroom Kingdom? That doesn't make any sense. How'd they grow up in Brooklyn, then? Were they sent there at some point, like Superman?
What the
origins?
fuck?
And how were they Italian Americans if they came from a world with no Italy and no America?
What the
maybe that'll be the plot
fuck?
of the next game. Maybe. I didn't have a breakdown or anything.
Okay, he actually thought Mario and Luigi came from Brooklyn. He thought Mario and Luigi were born in Brooklyn, then were kidnapped and went to Yoshi's Island, and then they were taken to the Mushroom Kingdom. What? I don't get it. This is his, like... like, he can't take... Like, he's having a mental breakdown over this. I don't fucking know. Let me just listen to
It's
this
not
again.
as though I was knocked into some kind of system shock over this, but the dissonance stuck with me for a while. By now I had more important things to worry about in school and life to be completely consumed by this. College prep.
Okay, here we go. I gotta re-listen to this. This is insane.
They'd actually met before. On a quest to rescue his brother. The idea of seeing Mario's origin story had me playing through this game like a man possessed, even though by that point a teenage social life was leaving less and less time.
Well, he
for
didn't have a
gaming.
social
I knew
life.
the end. I figured Mario and Luigi would find their way back to Brooklyn, along with seeing their Earthrealm digs visualized for the first time in a game. I was intrigued to see if any indications would be made about how and why they found their way back to Mushroom Kingdom years
No
later.
one
The
ever thought
possibilities.
that they came
And so,
from
after a climactic battle against a
Brooklyn.
towering,
That was
Godzilla-sized
just a
Bowser,
joke.
another image I'd always wanted to see. I settled in to watch as the game's ending credits played out over an animation of the stork-flying baby Mario and Luigi back home. Any moment now, I just knew I'd see a 16-bit New York skyline come into view. But, instead, the closing text and final image tell a different story, as the brothers are delivered to. Where Mom and Dad live. The Mushroom Kingdom. What? Mario and Luigi were born in the Mushroom Kingdom? That doesn't make any sense. How'd they grow up in Brooklyn, then? Were they sent there at some point, like Superman, unaware of their real origins? And how were they Italian Americans if they came from a world with no Italy and no America? Ooh, maybe
because there's nothing ever in
I
fiction
didn't have a breakdown
that's
or anything.
like
It's not as
based
though I
on
was
the
knocked
real
into some kind
world.
of system shock over this, but the dissonance stuck with me for a while. By now I
I
had
don't
more
even
important
know
things to
what
worry about in school and life to be completely consumed by this. College prep classes, girls, sex, drugs, and social hierarchy were giving me my headaches. High school, after all.
Okay, well, he didn't go to college because he's an asshole. He never got any effect with girls because what kind of girl would ever let him touch them? Sex, yeah, right. He's too much of a pussy for drugs, and he was at the bottom of the social hierarchy. I don't know what to say.
Now that refuge was tinged ever so slightly with doubt. It wasn't that not from Brooklyn changed anything fundamental, but it felt so cavalier. That it wasn't presented as a surprise drove home the reminder that most of what Generation NES considered canon for its games was often just hastily composed film mythos for US ad copy. And part of the story I'd been devoted to might have just been a narrative placeholder for Nintendo.
So now he's talking about it like this fucking like it's some sort of conspiracy that Nintendo covered up. Like that Nintendo covered up the birth of Mario. Like that for years they claimed that he was born in Brooklyn, and then they suddenly pulled a bait and switch on him. And like it seems like it shattered him on the fundamental level to find out that Mario and Luigi weren't actually from Brooklyn. I didn't know anyone who ever thought they came from Brooklyn. Like, did anybody here ever think they came from Brooklyn? I don't know. Whatever.
If I'd learned to keep my Nintendo worship relatively in check in the cigarette is cooler days, I could hold it back for the age of everything but PlayStation is for kids. Mario games had been my thing, my refuge from everything else when I needed them. Now that refuge was tinged ever so slightly with doubt. It wasn't that not from Brooklyn changed anything fundamental, but it felt so cavalier. That it wasn't presented as a surprise drove home the reminder that most of what Generation NES considered canon for its games was often just hastily composed.
Wait a minute, there was no canon. It's like that bullshit timeline that they released for Zelda, which I don't believe for a second. There wasn't a canon. It was like, I don't know, the idea that there's a canon and that there's kind of a consistent mythos came about much later. And they tried to retroactively apply things from the past and fit them into that mythos. But no, Mario and Luigi are just two humans from the Mushroom Kingdom who happen to be culturally Italian. Because it's a fucking work of fiction and it doesn't have to conform to the real world cultures and whatever.
So my thoughts for US and copy. And part of the story I've been devoted to might have just been a narrative placeholder for Nintendo. There's a moment vitally important in the development of any geek, nerd, or whatever else you want to call it when it finally sinks in all the way that the people creating whatever character or property you've let colonize a part of your imagination just aren't as devoted to it as you are. That, to them.
Oh my god, I gotta post this. This is amazing. Okay, let's reread this. There's a moment vitally important in the development of any geek, nerd, or whatever else you want to call it, when it finally sinks in all the way that the people creating whatever character or property you've let colonize a part of your imagination just aren't as invested in it as you are. To them it's a job, but for me it was so much more.
For me, this was it. How much sense did it make to be trying to work out the bigger relationships between the characters and the broader scope of their world? What was the point of keeping meticulous mental, and, yes, also physical, lists and chronologies of Mario's friends, enemies, worlds, abilities, all that? What did it matter if I could point out, on a moment's notice, that no Cobbins, exploding shell troopers, were only found in Sarah's Island and only in one game? Why should I put so much of myself into this when Mario's masters couldn't even keep his
Because you're
straight?
fucking autistic.
It all happened so gradually, and in the background of so many.
And you just made a bunch of shit up that wasn't
until
there.
much later. But this was probably a turning point for me as much as it was for Mario. Young adulthood now coming into full effect. It was the best possible time to free up some mental space now that school and life choices were going to start counting for something. I had college to...
So his entire life was changed because Mario didn't come from Brooklyn. This was like the greatest trauma in his life.
Get ready for the career path to start actually charting. I'd long since transitioned from filmmaking to game designing as a dream trajectory. It was time to move on, if only a bit, from Mario and Nintendo, just not all at once. The last stint in 1996, I was a sophomore in high school. Bill Clinton was dutifully pretending that Bob Dole presented any kind of challenge to his second presidential term. But for me and millions of others still playing Generation NES gamers, the biggest thing happening was the Nintendo 64. The path into this next generation of consoles had been an awkward one for the house Miyamoto built and a trying time for their stalwart fans. After a series of fits and starts that included the disastrous Virtual Boy platform, Nintendo wound up skipping the 32-bit race entirely, getting by on the success of mega hits like Donkey Kong Country and Yoshi's Island, while bolstered by the aging SNES's stability in a market that was otherwise in total chaos. Sega's Genesis had collapsed under the weight of poorly realized peripherals, and their two subsequent consoles, Sega CD and Saturn, en route to 1999's Dreamcast, suffered from poor sales in North America. The PlayStation was moving units, but hadn't quite landed a killer app of its own. So it was announced with some fanfare that their next console would leap ahead into the 64-bit realm, and would use the new power to take video games all the way into the third dimension. And, as ever, Mario would lead the way. Of course, 3D had a place in gaming from the very beginning. Vector-based arcade titles like Star Wars made shapes from glowing lines. PC fare like Wolfenstein and Doom sent players wandering down flatly decorated hallways made from perspective warp 2D surfaces, and SNES titles like Mario Kart and Pilot Wings simulated three-dimensional space via mode 7-inch scaling and rotation. But the early images of
didn't he
Super
say at the beginning that this wasn't going to be a... Okay, let me just go through this. I want to get to Mario brick by brick. Okay, let's see here.
Unlike times before, however, they had a viable escape option. Sony was only too happy to have them, and a sea change was signaled when Squaresoft announced that Final Fantasy, a mega-popular RPG franchise that had always lived under the Nintendo umbrella, was jumping ship to Sony for its 7th installment. For a time, veterans of the first console war like myself tried to mount a vain, half-hearted defense, more out of nostalgia for the last conflict than passion for this one. But the writing was on the wall. Final Fantasy VII became an instant, generation-defining classic. More and more long-time Nintendo developers bailed from the good ship Mario, and it soon became clear that the hemorrhaging of games and gamers from Nintendo was not going to stop. Instead of being the beginning of a new era, Super Mario 64 inches wound up being Mario's last big traditional game, for a while his only adventure title, outside of the offbeat RPG Paper Mario on the N64. Mascot multiplayer games would be his jurisdiction for the rest of the console's lifespan. Mario Kart 64, 3 entries in the Mario Party virtual board game series, and perhaps most importantly Super Smash Bros., a fighting game whose roster was comprised of Nintendo characters, an idea I was hoping someone would execute for as long as I'd been gaming. But by then reality was crystallizing. My brother and I had a PlayStation and even the ill-fated Dreamcast, and even I had to concede that the wait between worthwhile N64 games was just too long. Even for me, the Nintendo age was over. A decade in darkness. I don't know that there was an exact moment in time when I effectively stopped playing video games. I just know that it happened. I don't recall a single moment when I simply said I'm done, especially since I never really fully quit cold turkey. All I can say for sure is that in one moment the vast majority of my free time was spent playing, reading about, and thinking about video games, and then it wasn't anymore. Despite its place in the overall narrative, I honestly don't feel like it was strictly a result of the first age of Nintendo coming to a close for my generation.
The first age of Nintendo?
The first sign of it was that I was spending more time dwelling in the gaming community than I was actually playing the games. Reading about the launch of Nintendo Powers America online site was my introduction to the concept of internet chat rooms and message boards, and it spurred me, and, with some nudging, my family, to finally get a good internet connection so that I might use them. I devoured the world of the early internet, particularly gaming sites. The hours once spent replaying my favorite games were replaced by hours of chatting and arguing about new ones. A new normal of gaming developed in my house. I learned about games, and my younger brother and sister did the playing. Mostly, though, it was a semi-unconscious decision about time management. High school had me focused on my career prospects. Soon enough I'd have my first job, clerking for a Blockbuster.
Clerking for a Blockbuster, that's his great achievement in life.
Filmmaking in a major way. For the first time I had a career path that seemed more attractive and more plausible than game design. Get into the movies. Writing, directing, special effects, maybe even criticism. Just get into the movies. With all this on my plate, something had to give, and somewhere along the line video games became that something. Thing is, as much as I was leaving games behind, it felt as though they were also leaving me behind. Gaming was rapidly changing from a geek subculture to something like the mainstream, and with more of my attention diverted elsewhere, I recognized it less and less every time I looked. Even Nintendo wasn't the Nintendo.
Okay, let me just scroll ahead. This is unbearably boring. Okay, what is this?
Meanwhile, my second Blockbuster job led me to what seemed at the time like a stroke of great fortune. An older gentleman, who will remain nameless, came in asking if he could leave some flyers. Turns out, he was starting up a film criticism show for local cable access television and was looking for on-air talent. Store policy said I had to tell him no, but it said nothing about me volunteering for the position myself. After a set of meetings and conversations, I was hired to do the show along with this person and a female co-host. The resulting show was what you'd expect from local cable, but it was exposure and a chance to work on my craft, such as it was. I was the colorful member of the team, the younger guy with the wild opinions and the deeper film knowledge. It was a fun time while it lasted. I'd never gotten much of a sense that anything was especially off about the guy running the show. I knew he was fairly conservative politically, ex-military and an ex-cop, but it had never come up in any kind of negative way. But upon the release of Mel Gibson's The Passion of Christ, and the controversy surrounding it, something seemed to change in him. I was fairly certain both co-hosts knew that I'd seen the film and hadn't cared for it, and expected it would make a good show when we sat down to review it. Instead, I got a phone call, and an unnervingly scary life experience. My employer, though, for the record, I wasn't technically being paid for my services on the show, summoned me to a meeting in his van, in an empty parking lot early in the morning. He did freelance security work, or he said he did, at least, and was on the job. This set off more red flags than I could count, but I showed up to meet him. He presented me with a printout of a scathing blog review I'd posted after seeing the film the first time, and wanted to know what I had against Jesus Christ. Unwisely, I offered that my objection was to the anti-Semitism in the film and was told those people had Schindler's Lists. Now this is our turn. I was then told that he...
So in other words, his boss was woke, and he got fired for being a cuck, His boss, his boss sounds awesome. This also doesn't sound like the truth at all. This so sounds like something he just made up.
I would be using the passion discussion as an occasion to promote the film's positive message, and that if I wouldn't go along by saying I liked the movie, my time on the show would be over. And that was that. I never heard from the guy again, but I know his show didn't last long without me. I'm told he behaved in a manner, because it's hearsay I won't get into specifics, that disturbed the production staff during the taping of the Passion episode, and that my name had come up, which had me walking around more than a little paranoid for a few weeks. But nothing ever came of it.
That doesn't sound like the truth at all. That sounds like something he made up.
By then, I've been selling movies for almost a decade, and while my time away from the medium left me a little shaky on the names and faces.
What the fuck? So he spent over a decade after high school selling Blockbuster,
soon after that, around 2005, if I recall correctly. But my ongoing friendship with a coworker from the first Blockbuster was able to finagle me a job with him at Best Buy, where I soon found myself moved from a morbid grind in the appliances department. Yes, we can swap the hinges on the fridge. Yes, the ice maker needs to be hooked up to water supply to the DVD, music and video games department. That was in those days the profit-driving centerpiece of any big electronics store. By then, I've been selling movies for almost a decade, and while my time away from the medium left me a little shaky on the names and faces, who are all these people and creatures on the Xbox and PS2 boxes? The skill set translated to selling games pretty handily, as you'll no doubt into it. It was hard to be around video games, even as a salesman, and not be drawn back toward them. But, in truth, I'd been nudging my way back for a while by then. It had been, for sure, 1 year since the console hooked up to my TV.
So, Sam
SNES
Dunlap
along with stacks of their games.
This book has nothing to do with, has nothing to do with Super Mario Brothers 3. It's a thinly veiled cry for help. Oh, I'm just gonna finish this chapter up, then I gotta go to bed.
The box somewhere in the back of a closet. The N64 was living in my sister's room. My brother had the GameCube and PS2 at college, but gaming had changed in my absence, and one of those changes had been that the console in your room was no longer the sole home of a serious gamer, and this change had been led by some old friends. I don't think I ever came right out and said I'm done with Mario, but even if I had, it turned out he wasn't done with me.
What the fuck does that mean? Is Mario some kind of stalker? I'm not done with Mario, but it turns out he wasn't done with me. Is it like Mario becoming a serial killer in this? Oh my god. What the fuck is this nonsense? So this is not an autobiography. This is supposed to be... This was his suicide note. It's supposed to be. He even says at the beginning, this is an analysis of Super Mario Brothers 3. This is not a history of Super Mario Brothers 3. This is not me just talking about my life. This is not me talking about the video game industry. It's... So he literally made this fucking massive bullshit to he made this fucking like massive bullshit book to try to like do an analysis of Super Mario 3, the kind at which where no one had ever done before, and he wasn't going to talk about the video game industry. He wasn't going to talk about the history of Mario. He was just going to analyze every single frame of Super Mario Brothers 3. But he wound up not analyzing any aspect of Super Mario 3, and it's just this rambling about what a fucking loser he is, and how his life was over the day that Super Mario was from Brooklyn. Okay, so I'm gonna end this part of it. As people are saying, this is a desperate cry for help and a suicide note. Night, guys. I'll talk to you later.